Very good. I'd like to call to order the September 26, 2023 work session. First item is item 4, curriculum 4.01, hydrophonic lab, high school. Dr. Leidy.
Yeah, so you got me a little fired up here. We're talking about science and integration and all this stuff, but Mr. Bitts wouldn't let me go very far with it. So I'm gonna
Well, I'll give my very unscientific definition of what we're even talking about here, and he can sort of jump in as he's itching to do. Because this is exciting. But if you're like me, you may even hear hydroponics and not be entirely sure of what we're talking about. So again, my unscientific definition. So usually when you grow something, you need a seed, you need soil, you need water, and you need light. And the idea behind hydroponics is that you are controlling for some of those variables and artificially creating some of those different situations for the plant to grow. So for example, you're growing something in a container where water is the primary source of nutrients to the plant and allowing it to grow, and LED lights are providing in a climate-controlled environment the opportunity for a plant to be able to continue to grow. And when you talk about food deserts and all kinds of things that our science experts are going to discuss in just a couple of minutes, it's a real opportunity to be able to grow in unfavorable conditions. How was that?
That was really good.
That's good. But it is exciting, and this is something, hydroponics is something that we have been investigating, and our science teachers in the district over the last number of years have been dabbling in, shall we say. You know, our biology teachers putting some labs together to engage students in growing plants in these other mediums. And on a small scale, we've had in our budget the opportunity to buy some small hydroponics kits and do some different things again in both the middle school and high school primarily. So in the meantime, while that's been going on, some of our neighboring school districts have also jumped in with some hydroponics projects, and we were invited to go to Steel High, where they host the Harrisburg University's hydroponics lab that is out there, which is a very cool site to be able to see. And we also have some hydroponics labs that have opened within our very school district. And that has created an additional opportunity for us to be able to branch out and expand the work that we're doing with hydroponics. So the goal tonight is to be able to share with you a little bit about why hydroponics, how is this fitting into our curriculum, why is this something that we've been interested in exploring, and then to be able to talk to you a little bit more about the opportunity that we have with one of our local businessmen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our experts, Mr. Heinzig and Mrs. Brumbaugh, who will talk a little bit more about what hydroponics is.
Good evening, everybody.
Hello.
Okay. I'd like to start with a quote before I talk a little bit about what the system is. I'm going to quote Robert Louis Stevenson. Don't judge each day by the harvest that you reap, but by the seeds that you plant. And I think that might seem a little on the nose, but it's apt nonetheless. With a system like this, yes, there's a product. There's a product with students, there's something to harvest, but I think the really important piece is that process, the seeds that we're planting with students. Seeds of curiosity, ingenuity, sustainability, opportunity. So I'm very excited about this as well. So what is it? You can see in the picture here, that shipping container that might look more at home on the back of a tractor trailer. That is the lab. It's a self-contained system. This one comes from Freight Farms. There's several companies that build them. And you can run from seed to harvested produce, typically lettuce type things, in just a few weeks. So it's a fast turnaround time. There's a computer controlled system that balances the nutrients that each specific species would require. It also controls the light exposure.
Controls the light exposure. Controls the light exposure. Controls the light exposure. Controls the light exposure. Controls the light exposure. Controls the light exposure.
Does it expose? Does it have anything with light exposure at all?
Right.
Yeah.
Ms. Morgan? Can I? Oh, okay. Do you want me to try calling you back? Or is it okay, you think? Okay. You still there?
I'm still here.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. That was very important. And so that monitoring of the light system, of the nutrients, it's taken care of through some custom software. You can see it in the bottom picture there on a laptop, where students would even be able to interact in that kind of tech level. And so it also has low water use. What's happening, and I'll show you here on the next slide, water is just trickling down at a really low volume with the nutrients through these vertical trays that hang. Almost like what you would see in the archives in a library, where you would roll the wheel and you can move one wall and another. There's several of those in the system. And so if we look at the bottom left picture, it's just the starting trays for the seedlings. Once they get established, they get put into the vertical system, which you see in the top left. So some small lettuce types growing there. And as the water drips through the system, anything that isn't collected by the plant funnels down into a trough and is reclaimed and reused in the system. I think they said that they were replacing the water every couple of months. So maybe 2 times a year, it sounded like they were having to replenish water, which is pretty awesome. And like Andy was pointing to, these systems are wonderful in places where there's soil issues, poor soil, no soil, water issues, climate issues for growing. You have a system like this, you can grow fresh, healthy food, and people can have access to it. In the last 2 pictures there, kind of the middle and the far right, you can just see the LED systems turned on. You can dial it in for the type of light that's needed. Plants tend to use the blue-violet end of the spectrum and the red end, and some plants need more than others. That's something for students to figure out and to test. Plants typically don't use the energy from the green section. That's why they're green, they're reflecting it. So how does this connect to what we are already doing in the science department, the curriculum work we've engaged in the past few years, as we looked at NGSS and now the state version of STEELS? This extends current course lessons that are already in place in our biology courses, all 3 levels in the Gen Bio, components in our AP Bio, and our new AP Environmental course. There are pieces in there that already get into a direct application with the hydroponic system. There are additional connections with the coursework that we have that could be made, where we might use this to bring in a phenomenon in teaching a concept that's already embedded. I can see connections there with earth and space, with water access, with sustainability, with soil, chemistry as we get into the nutrient mix for the water that would also bridge into our physical science course, and then overall STEM opportunities that we want to keep increasing no matter what. The connections to the national NGSS standards and the new Pennsylvania version, this is exactly what they're aiming at and talking about when they want students engaging in scientific practices, which are our transfer goals in the new curriculum. Those are the ways in which we engage and do science. We were all taught the scientific method, and while that's not wrong, it's not how most science is done today. It's really in engaging in these practices, which I'll show you in just a second. There are also cross-cutting concepts, which are just common things that occur scientifically in nature that we would want students to be looking at and looking for, no matter what the topic is. And so this would serve that as well. And then our core ideas, which are kind of the content pieces of the standards. So this is not the last time I'm sure that I'm going to get to share this with you. But those science practices, if you just take a look at some of those processes, you can see where that might apply in myriad situations, but definitely in the hydroponic lab. Asking and generating questions that help define problems, developing using models, investigations, interpreting data, math and computational thinking, constructing explanations, designing solutions, engaging in argument from evidence, and obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. All of those I can see applied in a system like this easily in multiple ways. And you can also see where the cross-cutting concepts could easily come in and play a role as well. So I'm going to pass the stage again.
Oh, thanks. One of the other exciting things about this opportunity is that there are curricular connections beyond the science department. And although it makes sense to start with the science department, we see possible connections in the future in the curriculum. When we're talking about our tech ed department, for example, those practices that Nathan just showed with asking questions and investigating are the same practices for the tech ed standards as well. The new Steel standards have the tech ed standards embedded within them. And really the standards are all about the interaction between technology and the environment. And so that is exactly what this is, for the students to see what that looks like, the impact of technology. In our social studies curriculum, you can see there's a transfer goal there about analyzing, interpreting sources critically, gaining perspective, perspective shaped by environment and experiences. We have human geography, for example. It's all about understanding how humans have used our Earth and how it's changed because of it. Any geopolitical discussions that are happening, we can see connections there as well. And our family and consumer science program as well has a sustainability thread throughout it, both on the culinary side and in the consumer side. So we see all kinds of possibilities. Our curriculum in general thrives on authentic opportunities and experiences, and this is just a beautiful example of that. And so we would be very excited for this.
To your point about students learning, and sometimes learning means breaking things, is there an opportunity for them to have a row or two or a sleeve that they're independently manipulating light and chemicals and things like that?
Yeah,
so
I think
if they
that's-
kill it off, it's okay kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that's a part of the idea, for sure, yeah.
Because I imagine that there's going to be mistakes made, and I certainly wouldn't want to have it need to be handled with such kid gloves that they can fail and make mistakes. So that's exciting. Thank you.
Yep. Sorry about that. Yep. So kind of turning the presentation from the academic focus and the programs to thinking about some of the other considerations. So in developing the proposal, I think much credit to Mr. Einsick, Mrs. Broombaugh, but also Mr. Betts and Mr. Harris for helping lead the conversations, Dick Kastner for thinking about the logistics around construction. And so that's really one of the next considerations connected to the hydroponics proposal is where does this fit on the high school site? How do we tie it into the building? And what are some of those considerations? And so in terms of the layout, this would be on the George Street side of the building, right, Mr. Harris? Not to put you on the spot, but I verified that with him just to make sure I was saying the right thing. It will be connected to an existing classroom there. And so Mr. Harris, Mr. Kastner, Crabtree, Rohrbaugh have considered the options there so that the container itself will open up into the building and be seamlessly connected. And so as we get to the next slide, we would be talking about the cost proposal, and there's really two elements to that. There's the lab structure itself, which is the container, and then there's the installation and build out, because what we just described in the previous slide of placing the container, the foundation for it, tying it into the building, transporting the container from the storage site, all of those things are additional costs beyond just the purchase price. And so as we kind of vetted out the proposal and arrived at what's this going to cost in terms of adding it to the district and building it into the existing high school, the structure itself would be $75,000, and then an approximate cost on installation and build out of $85,000. I trust that Mr. Kastner is obviously going to do his level best, as he does with all of our contractors, and negotiate time and materials. And so that 85, I would say, is a conservative number. And I don't want to promise anything, as Mr. Kastner has taught me, but probably.
That's the intent of
Yeah.
what.
Probably an opportunity to maybe do better there. So in developing an estimate, the total cost would be $160,000. I think the only other thing I wanted to bring to the board's attention was it is an opportunity to partner with a local business. I think a generous opportunity, but always, how do we cross-check, right? You know, so the auditor and me, the cost of the $75,000 to say, where does that fall in the grand scheme of things, and are we comfortable with the price? Ultimately, we kind of verified that in two ways. So the estimated market cost of $120,000, one was through freight farms themselves to say, for a couple-year-old container, what's the market value depreciation that they normally see? And that's consistent with this $120,000 number based on the condition it's in and the age of the unit. But also there's brokers out there that sell, I've learned a lot through this, both academics and also a lot about these containers themselves. You can find them for sale across the country, and that is, the selling prices are also consistent with what freight farms have told us directly. And so from our perspective, the $75,000 is comfortable to us in terms of recommending that moving forward. In fact, I think it's a good deal, and we appreciate the partnership. Again, I think the community, the school district, the parents, is what makes Mechanicsburg such a special place. And so in the end, we're recommending to move forward with it for the reasons Mr. Einsick outlined and Mrs. Brumbaugh, but also in terms of the total price and how it fits into the high school construction project. That would be a recommendation for the next board meeting to act on it and begin the next step, which would include the board consideration of the proposal at the October 3rd board meeting. Through the winter months, we would finalize the detail of the lab operations. So what does weekly and monthly maintenance programs look like? And then also, what's a staffing plan around it and the operating budget? So I know a lot of times we talk about staffing plan through the lens of part-time and full-time employees. This isn't a full-time employee by any stretch, but I think for transparency's sake with the board, it would require some additional help to keep and maintain the program and the lab. What's some oversight and the connection to the curriculum? And so we're kind of still working through the details of that, but ultimately comfortable with the proposal with where we're at currently. Then if all goes well and the board agrees this is something eventually we want to move forward with, we would be looking then at a spring relocation of the lab and the building tie-in. I think with Mr. Harris and Mr. Kastner, we'd have to work through the logistics of how's it fit into the phasing plan, when's the right time, those sorts of things. And then ultimately in the fall, again, tentatively speaking, that it might be operational. And so a very exciting proposal with some next steps and then questions and comments from the board.
So this lab is operational right now. This is the one that's on Fisher Road.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is.
I thought that looked familiar.
Yeah.
Where is that?
Right near Friendship Park. There's a little farm that's doing a farm doing plants and stuff built on that property, and there's a house that was built in front of behind the farm to make a farm stand and everything, and then there's that trailer is right off of the farm.
It's almost where when you're driving out Fisher Road, where the road bends and curves so sharply.
You know, the quick. right quick left. Right there.
So you mentioned operational maintenance expenses. What, can you give us a ballpark of what those would be? Because
I think, not to dance around the question, I think some of it would come out of how we use it with the academic program, like the scale of it. So how much output are you trying to achieve from it? Is it strictly for the academic, the learning, or I think there's a lot of options. Do you grow enough that maybe could the cafeteria use it? I think there's questions about that. Could you give it away to families that might have a need? I think there's questions about that. There's lots of layers to it, and so I think depending on the scale of how we want to use it would depend on the need to support it in terms of hours. But I don't think we would view it as kind of how we do our seasonal appointments around recreation and athletics and extra duty, that it would be an additional responsibility for someone that would work either weekly or monthly to maintain it, and so it's not a full-time position.
So a stipend, probably a stipend for an individual that would be similar to the other stipends that we provide, and then the electrical cost to run it. The water, as you pointed out, I didn't even realize it was that efficient, so the water is really not that much of a cost. And then the maintenance of the unit and the replacement of the unit is probably the biggest issue that I could see from a board perspective moving forward. But that, maintaining the electronics within there and upgrading those over time, I would see as a bigger operational cost than the annual maintenance of it.
so like, I mean, there'd be seeds and, I mean, that's.
That would all be part of a cost center within a department, most likely.
Like on that note, to more on the academic programming side, like where would you initially use this, Nathan? Like as part of Earth and Space, or would it just be like an add-on?
Yeah, so out of the gate, we can walk in and use it in biology, all 3 levels, AP Bio and AP Environmental, because we're already doing things with plants and hydroponics.
Right.
So we actually have in the budget from last year, kind of small classroom-sized shelving units for hydroponics to do some of those tests before we would then have maybe the performance side of things go into the larger scale production in the lab.
So it'd really just be a more realistic add-on to existing
Yes.
programs initially to,
Yes.
right, hands-on type.
Absolutely, yeah.
And do we have any idea, like electric-wise, like to run the HVAC heating, is it expensive for the amount of size of it, or is it?
It's a good question.
Just curious.
It really, it's kind of inconspicuous, and like the outside of it looks like a shipping container, and then you open it up and look inside, and the lighting, as an example, is LED lights, and so the electric usage for that perspective, I would expect would I don't want to say minimal, but not a huge factor. The water, the utilities, so there's not a whole lot there. The air conditioning and heating probably would be an element to it as far as the HVAC, but it's not a huge space either and connected to the building, so.
What would really be cool would be to make the roof solar panels to generate the energy from the solar panels that just power the thing itself, and then you unplug. So,
It's the beauty of beginning with something
Yeah.
and what that could turn into. And all of these ideas, initially, it's not going to be that, but all of these ideas have so much potential to them. And as a farm boy growing up, thinking that you could grow plants inside a storage container, never thought that would ever happen. And yet, you got to believe that that's a future for so many reasons.
But the HVAC would more just be like a reverse cycle unit that's probably on it too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like an excessive amount of heat would be needed. It would just be maintained at a particular temperature depending on.
And I think the fact that it's connected to the actual building is going to help with that. So, I mean, the idea of the solar panel, all I can think of is like, wouldn't it be awesome if students figured that out? Right? To take panel-wise and how to integrate that, that'd be so cool.
we'll have that deleted from the record.
Let them decide on their own. Okay, Mr. Lawbone. Yeah.
Remove that.
Inquiry-based.
Yes.
So exciting opportunity through a generous partnership offer, and I think exciting connections to our programs and opportunities for students. And so.
And who's the company that we're working with? Is it
It's, the name of the farm is.
Farm is within you farm, yes. It's the Farinella family. Right. I couldn't remember the name of it. I drive by it 100 times, but I can't remember the name of it.
I think it's a great addition.
Very good.
Right. Any further questions or comments on item 4.01? Thank both of
Thank
you
you.
for
Thank
an
you.
excellent
Thank you very
report.
much.
Thank you.
Very informative. We'll move on to item 7, policy. Item 7.01, update on extracurricular policy committee. Mr. Bitts.
Back again here. All right, well, I'm
More
excited.
in your line of expertise here.
That's right. Excited to be able to share with you an update from the committee that we've had 3 meetings with over the last couple of months. And it's obviously been a discussion that we've been having even beyond that. But really the purpose of tonight is to not only share that update of where our conversations have been over the last, again, 3 meetings in a couple of months, but also to hear your feedback and questions as we discuss some of the areas that we continue to grapple with as a committee, and to be able to hear some of your perspectives with the goal of being able to ultimately go back and incorporate and continue to finalize some discussions around some policy adjustments that we hope to be able to bring to you at the October work session. So next month at this time, being able to bring a first read of a policy and potentially a couple policies that have some ripple effects. But that's still to come as part of the presentation. But that's the goal for tonight. Give you an update, hear some of your questions and feedback, and then be able to look ahead to that first read. So to remind you of our overarching question as a committee was to be able to examine how do our policies and practices support our beliefs around extracurriculars. And I think there's value in going back for just a couple of minutes to the why behind why we're examining this, and to discuss maybe some of the background behind the committee, but also some of the problems that were seen through our examination of our policies and practices. So as a reminder, we know that as part of our district beliefs, we have it front and center, this idea of learning beyond the classroom as an extension of the learning that happens within our program. That co-curricular and extracurricular activities enhance a well-rounded educational experience, and ultimately those connect to these experiences that we want to be preparing our students for their career education and work goals. So it's a part of who we are at its core. And again, a reminder that this was added within the comprehensive plan because it was spoken to by so many within our, not only the comprehensive planning committee, but those 400 some people that contributed their voice to the comprehensive plan. Additionally, we have a goal that touches on this area, school environments that support belonging. Part of our action steps within that goal is to audit district policies, systems, and programs, including all these areas, curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular, to examine access and belonging and making modifications for improvement as necessary. So this was one of those areas that we said we wanted to be able to examine. And quite frankly, when we point back to some of the other program evaluations and committees that have met over the last couple of years, these policies were brought up as part of that as well. Even part of the athletics program evaluation, some discussion was touching on the same areas here that we're talking in a broader space about extracurriculars in general. So with that as the backdrop, the question becomes, what are the problems? And really we zoned in within this committee on 3 particular areas to really be able to have discussion about and dive deep into current practices in comparison to our policy. First one being development. What does the development of our extracurricular opportunities look like? What does our funding look like for our extracurriculars? And then what are some of those other practices and supports that we have around our extracurricular opportunities that we want to make sure are in line with our beliefs? So we're going to go through each one of those buckets, if you will, one by one, and talk about some of the issues that were uncovered. First one being development. So see this as being an issue of process. So we can see that there is some misalignment, if you will, between what is in the policy. And when I say policy, there's obviously the specific policy that you all vote on and be able to enact, but then there's also attached administrative regulations, which are obviously what you call upon us as administrators to put into place to make sure that the policies are enacted in the way that they're intended. So when I say policies there, that's a little bit more broad, if you will, than just the policy. But policies and administrative regulations, I would say, quite frankly, haven't been aligned to our everyday practices when it comes to the development of extracurriculars. And that's something that we need to be able to get aligned through this review. So for example, we need to really formalize a process for developing new extracurricular activities. And this is something that I wouldn't say we haven't been doing, but it's something that we definitely can do better. There is a lot of work that Mr. Harris spearheaded at the high school to be able to put some processes in place, and he was able to use the assistant principals there at the high school to be able to help manage that. Some of that came, if you remember, a number of years ago when cyber school students and homeschool students began through regulation to have the opportunity to participate in our extracurriculars. We had to put some processes in place, but we really put them in place just to be able to make sure we were doing what we needed to for those groups. But it's time to be able to formalize that a little bit more and be able to branch out beyond the high school, so that's a district-wide initiative to be able to formalize that process. Additionally, we believe that through the formalization of that process and perhaps some handbooks and discussion of what our philosophies are, that we can increase the support to our advisors. We believe that our advisors are a key component to extracurriculars being successful. Whether they are a paid advisor or a volunteer advisor, we believe that their part, and the committee definitely said that over and over again, the adults that we're putting with our students in these activities are so critical. So we want to be able to increase the support that we're providing to them, and we think that we can do that through this process. Again, equipping them with some other handbooks and things like that.
I'm assuming we're using advisor in a broad sense. That could be a coach, it could be some other leader that's championing that activity.
Yep, you got it. Yep. And then finally, refresh the district purpose statement for extracurriculars. So how can we, as the foundation of this, make sure that what we're saying is the purpose is refreshed to reflect what we believe here at Mechanicsburg. And here's the statement that we came up with as a group to be able to, again, refresh what was already a statement in the policy. Extracurricular activities are value enhancing the educational experience of their participant, and we support the growth and development of students through extending the school experience beyond curricular offerings as an additional outlet for student expression. We had a lot of good debate as a committee about what does access look like for extracurriculars. Should we be saying that every single one of our students that go to Mechanicsburg should be involved in an extracurricular? Is that something that we believe? And where we ultimately landed as a committee was with the thought that we want all of our students to have an opportunity, whether it's through our curricular program or an extracurricular, to be able to express themselves and their talents in some way. And maybe that is in some elective courses that are provided through the regular curricular program. But for many of our students, that expression, that ability to, as the next one says, discover and develop special qualities and abilities may come out through an extracurricular program as well. And we want to make sure that we have those opportunities for our students. We additionally want to strengthen the sense of belonging that participants feel towards their school. There's lots of research out there that will tell you that that sense of belonging that is able to be gained from being a part of an extracurricular activity does carry over into their performance during the school day. I'm studying for my dissertation, so I can talk to you about that for a while. Fostering relationships among participants. So being able to, within the group, be able to develop a cohesive group that begins to, again, create relationships that encourage students and ultimately encourages them academically throughout the school day as well. Broadening understanding of oneself and others, and then collaborating, competing, and performing outside of the district in a pursuit of excellence. We talked a lot about in the committee that extracurriculars is our opportunity to begin to be outward facing into the community, whether that be through competing, or performing, or simply collaborating with others, other organizations in our community. So I'm excited about the updates we did here. I think they reflect some really good, rich conversation from the committee and do reflect our values well. So that is all some work that we feel like we've already made some good strides in, and some pieces that we can formalize and bring forward to put in place. The next piece, I'll be quite honest with you, is where we're especially looking for your feedback and for your thoughts here. And that's the question of funding and the issues of access. And here, when we talk about the issues, it really comes down to what we as a committee believe has some misalignment between what we have as our beliefs as a district and the practices that are in place. And I'll take you on a little bit of a historical reminder of where we've been, and some of you were at the table when some of these decisions were made, so certainly there will be opportunity for you to chime in as well. But to give you some perspective, so here's our district, the relationship between our district and activity boosters and the family. So I'll talk to you about why I put the lines there that I did. See, activity is obviously an extension of the district. It's a part of us, all of these extracurricular activities. If you remember, our booster organizations used to be a part of us. They used to be financially and organizationally part of the school district. And a number of years ago, basically the IRS said, you can't do that anymore. And all of our booster organizations had to split off as independent 501c3s. Now what that means is that financially they're independent. Financially they are accountable to the IRS and to the government. But organizationally, they're still accountable to us. They exist because the activity exists. They exist because our district exists. So sometimes, especially for folks that are new to some of our booster organizations, that can be a confusing point. I thought we were independent and we could kind of do our own thing, but you're saying that's not the case, and that's true. Financially, they're accountable to the government for doing all their taxes and keeping track of their money, although a few of them do contract us, if you will, to support them in that. But financially, they're independent, but organizationally, they're still dependent on us as a district. Now, obviously, there's a dashed line there between family and boosters, because it would be silly for us not to acknowledge the fact that our booster organizations are our families. Our families, for the most part, are those who are making up the boosters. If you extend the definition of the boosters to talk about Operation Wildcat, Wildcat Foundation, certainly it's families and community to some extent, but certainly for the most part, our booster organizations are our families. So that's kind of our current structure. And ultimately, we know that there's opportunity for the district to be able to provide financial support to our activities. And I'll say even beyond financial support, sometimes it's facility support. We provide facilities for our activities to be able to engage in their activity in. Additionally, then, the boosters are also providing financial support to these activities. So a number of years ago, I believe it was 2012, made the decision through really difficult budget times and budget conversations, and again, some of you were a part of these really difficult conversations, to tell our booster organizations that they need to provide 10% back. And again, just from my memory and from the conversations that we've had, and right now preparing for this and at the committee, it was a really tough time. It was a tough decision to be able to say that every $1,000 we were looking at through program evaluations and saying, how do we avoid furloughing teachers? How do we avoid cutting teachers? How do we avoid cutting programs? And ultimately, we were able to say, we need some support in this. If we're going to be able to keep these programs going, and if we're going to be able to keep from cutting another teacher, we can probably save a teacher if we get this 10% back. Ultimately, that 10% in this past year, to give you some perspective, amounted to $65,000. Not sure what the total was back when the 10% first was initiated. Maybe some others around the table remember it.
Just shy of 50, I think.
So that has grown to $65,000 that we've recouped from organizations as a district over that time. What that has done, though, ultimately, as we surveyed a number of different extracurriculars, and we talked to, again, this committee was made up of not only board administration and advisors, coaches, but also athletic director representatives from music, representatives from our booster organizations, one from MMA and one also from athletics boosters, representing a number of different sports. We also had someone from a non-music and athletic speech and debate, and a few others that they advise was represented. But through all that information that was compiled, what we've seen is an increased financial pressure on families. I think there's a number of reasons for that. We'll talk about that here in a second, but we've definitely seen over time that the 10% contribution and the cost of activities in general have been passed along in an increasing rate to families themselves. So what does that look like? Ultimately, I know the board grappled with the idea of pay to play and the idea of what should this contribution look like, and ultimately settled on the idea of the 10% of the organization being able to provide this amount to the activity as opposed to individual families. Well, in a sense, over time, it has become indirectly and directly families that have been directly contributing to this 10% and to the activities themselves. What this has looked like is probably in its softest form, if you will, would be fundraiser opt-outs. So the opportunity to say, hey, we're doing this fundraiser for the organization, and we're really hoping that everybody collects this amount, or sells this amount of subs, or something like that, and giving families the opportunity to say, you know what, we don't want to sell any subs, we're just going to give you $50 and we're going to leave it at that. So I would say that was maybe the softest, if you will, of direct costs to families, because there's a choice there. There also has been booster club membership fees. So some booster clubs have said, sure, your child's participating in the activity no matter what. If you would like to be a member of the booster club, then you need to pay $20, $50, so on to become members of the booster club. And quite frankly, it has turned in some cases to flat out dues that organizations are charging families and saying at the beginning of their activity that these are membership dues for your child to be a part of this particular activity. And that has ranged in some cases around $100. In other cases, it's been around $250. And in some cases, it's been over $1,000 for dues to be able to be a part of some extracurricular activities that we have here at the school. So along with those, that pressure from it becoming a little bit more direct asks of families is the challenges of fundraising in general. Just the other week on our PTO meeting, the PTO parents were saying as well, and any of you that were part of PTO meetings or try to raise money for any variety of reasons know that it's always a challenge. But our PTOs have talked about how more and more it has become an increasing challenge to be able to raise money from the masses, and even trying to get fairly small dollar amounts has been more challenging than ever before. And what we've ultimately created in some of these cases is, I believe, is an inadvertent barrier to access, because we have folks that are either looking at a $250 price tag, and in some cases perhaps they're able to pay it, but is that something that we believe our families should have to pay to be a part of certain organizations? or perhaps they're looking at that price tag and they're not able to pay it and they don't even pursue it because it's just not something that is able to be done. I will say that with the best intentions, many of our organizations have looked at how can we provide scholarships or provide opportunities to say families in need either have a reduced rate or perhaps don't have a rate at all. But in some cases, in many cases, that involves the family coming forward and in some ways putting their poverty on display to say, this is a challenge for us, can you help us with this? In some cases, even filling out applications saying that we have a need and here's why we believe that we should receive extra money and not have to pay this particular rate. Again, I think all of that's being done with the best of intentions, trying to be able to still provide an opportunity for students that are in families that are struggling. But I think the more and more we look at our demographics and the more and more we try to have the students on our field and stage and courts mirroring the students that are in our hallways, I think those are the kinds of things that we really have to grapple with and push back on.
And can you help me understand, back in my day at the Booster Club, the Booster Club didn't control whether you could participate in the activity or not. That was the advisor, I think is the term we're using.
Correct.
Is that changed now? If you don't pay the $250, you can't participate in the activity?
So I would say no. I am not aware of a single situation where somebody has been told you can no longer participate because you didn't pay this. I would say that some of those dues and some of the Booster Club fees have been advertised by the booster organization as being, this is what we want you to be doing to be able to support the activity. Some of them have been advertised directly by the coach, district personnel, etc., saying this is what we're expecting. I think it has a different connotation between those two. And
An opportunity for one of our handbooks.
yes, agreed. So that would be the only thing I'd say. I'm not aware of a single student that has been said, well, you're off the team because you didn't pay this, but I do think there's different ways that the pressure is being applied.
So Andy, just to clarify a little debate on that is, so if a student's family is unable or chooses not to participate in the Booster Club, then in essence, the Booster Club's still responsible to pay for the 10% of the
Correct.
total cost of that activity.
And we've seen boosters, some of the booster clubs shared, some of the representatives there said that paying the 10% has not been a hardship at all, that they've been able to do that fairly readily. And then there's certainly other organizations that we know, and we've even heard in the past at the board level here, that have really struggled with being able to pull that 10% together.
Doesn't that kind of single that student out or that family out, especially if it is due to a bona fide economic need? If it's just an opinion, that's entirely different because they're making that choice. But if they actually cannot afford to pay, then the Booster Club itself knows that person's not, essentially everybody knows that person's not participating. It really.
But the other part that we talked about for a little bit is sometimes that is even just a barrier that, you have a student that would really like to play X, sport X. We'll say pickleball. They really want to play pickleball, but they know that it's going to cost $100 dues to sign up for pickleball. And so they won't even start the conversation of joining it, and they'll just pull back because they'll know I can't go to mom and dad and say I need $100 to play pickleball, so I'm just going to walk away. So it's not even so much that they're in there and then they realize that they have to shell out $100. It's sometimes that barrier to even getting that opportunity. So they'll pull back and say, I'm just not even going to attempt to, or I'm not even going to ask about it because of the fact that I know we can't afford it, and we're too proud to go in and say, hey, I need money, I need financial assistance. So that's one of the conversations that we had as well, was it isn't only that you're in it and you may not be able to afford it. There are times where, someone that really could benefit from an extracurricular activity won't participate because they know that there's that fee standing in front of them that will prevent it from doing so.
This is a great conversation. I don't want to stop it, but I'll share a couple more slides here that I think will spark the conversation further. Because the question becomes, what is the right formula then? Because again, I don't think anyone's doing anything nefarious here to be able to take opportunities away from kids, and everybody is trying to do their level best to be able to support the extracurriculars in a way that we put a great performance on, a great competition on, and so on. So what is the right formula for us? Because every activity has some measure of district support, booster support, and direct family support. Whether you're talking about the family buying the kid the baseball glove, or paying for an instrument, renting an instrument, those kinds of things. There's different expenses and different support along the way. And the question really becomes, these are just three scenarios, if you will. You've got all the way on the left, if you're going down the column there, you've got a scenario where it's largely district funded. So an organization that is receiving mostly district funds, that's supplemented and supported a little bit further by boosters, and then the family has some role within that, whether it's direct costs for something like baseball glove or shoes or something like that, or their time, talent, and treasure that they're giving to a booster club to make the meat that's going to go to the concession stand, or to be able to run the concession stand, or any of those kinds of things. So the left-hand side is mostly district funded. The middle would be what I would call probably a shared funding model, where the district is chipping in a good bit, the boosters are chipping in a good bit, and again, the family has some role in it. The right-hand side would be, quite frankly, a fully self-sustaining model, where perhaps in this activity there is no booster organization. The district, maybe the district's contribution is providing facilities and providing the time that the advisors or coach is spending with the students. But aside from that, the family is providing the financial support for that activity. And the complexity is really brought to life when you think of some of the examples of all these different extracurriculars that we have in our district. I'll just let you read through the list there. So as a committee, as we really wrestled with this and unpacked this, we said there are definitely some things that aren't aligned with our beliefs, but we also know that when we look at this whole list, and this is just some examples, that I don't know that ultimately as a district that we can provide the same kind of support to athletics, marching band, and musical as what we're going to provide on the French trip or to ski club. So ultimately it goes back to that question of, do different activities have different formulas, if you will, of what that support would look like, and how do we best support our extracurriculars to continue to move forward. And certainly there's connections to the other policies, because if we change the dial, if we turn the dial on any one of these things and we say that, for example, that we are expecting more from our booster organizations, then our fundraising policy and our booster support organization policy, that needs to reflect that as well, to be able to open up the doors for them to increase the fundraising that they're doing. On the flip side, if we're saying that as a district that there's going to be more support and we're going to expect that dues are not a piece of the equation for our students and families, then we have to make sure, again, that the other policies reflect that as well. So our next steps is to really be able to determine recommendations for policy 122 specifically. And the two areas that we've targeted as a committee that we really need to wrap our heads around to be able to make this determination and bring a first reading to the board is specifically, what do we do about the 10% policy, and what do we do about a statement that, two statements really, that are in the policy right now that opens the door for dues. So with that, we want to be able to make those recommendations. We want to be able to bring that first read to this group. And then we also need to continue to look at additional policies and practices to make sure that everything is aligning, as I just said, where a change in the dial on one of these may result in some things on the other side, whether it's through a policy or perhaps through an AR.
Well, and to Mr. Bradley's point about the fact that just knowing that there's a fee may turn off anybody considering it. What have we done around musical instruments? My understanding is there is a fee, and so do we feel like that turns kids away from that? And do we have to factor that into this as well as we're looking at what do we do with the 10%? Should we think about what do we do for anybody that's faced with a fee?
So musical instruments is one that I would say that over time, the music department has tried to build up a reserve of instruments that
If they
are.
come forward and say, I have a need, and all the things we were saying are bad for the dues too, and get them waived.
You're absolutely right. So each year they purchase a certain number of extra instruments of different types and have those available through the way that they approached instrument tryouts. It used to be that families had to come at night to be able to try out instruments and say that they were interested. That's now done during the school day so that every student gets an opportunity to try every instrument that they want to, and then be able to take paperwork home to express to their family what they were interested in and what they may have done well practicing with the directors. But I do think that that's something that we can continue to, it's one of those expenses, whether it's that, transportation, it's one of those additional expenses that I think we need to see what does access look like.
Under boosters, you mentioned Operation Wildcat, Wildcat Foundation. I'm assuming that would include businesses and nonprofits that support. My sense is that there's some untapped resources there. Has that been part of the discussion?
So many times, I can't say that was part of the committee's discussion, but many times when different organizations come to us as a district, and it could come to any different person, we often say, how about you channel this through the Wildcat Foundation? Is often the one we use, but sometimes it's Operation Wildcat.
I'm thinking like even ads and programs though. I mean, that doesn't really show up anywhere. Would that come under booster? Like I think about nonprofits and businesses that even like, I think the scoreboard at the football field is, like, and I had a conversation with Seth about this, is just thinking about our church. We're often asked by 6, 8 different organizations for sponsorship for a program, and I said to Seth, I would rather pay a flat fee. Like, could we make arrangements where you give $2,000 and you're promoted in every communication that goes out, rather than being approached by different groups or finding out that some group didn't know that you were interested. I feel like that's really an untapped resource.
Yeah, and to Mr. Pahanik's credit, I think all the way back when he was hired, if I remember correctly, it was part of his entry plan to look at alternative revenue sources. And at the time, as the superintendent, I said, in due time, we'll get to that. But as we were going through the capital campaign of the Wildcat Foundation, we were trying to be considerate of the community and not hitting them in too many different ways. But to his credit, he very much believes that, to use your terminology, untapped potential of alternate revenue sources, specifically to athletics, but the application of that is something that, you know, we could continue to look at.
Yeah.
I think that's a connected conversation, but a different conversation in policy 122. I think that how we generate the funding is a different conversation.
And I hope you understand, mentioning his name, I was just talking about prior conversations, not
Understood.
feeling like that should be something that
But he too has said that on many occasions.
Yeah, there's that.
There's potential there.
I'm specifically tuned into the sports community, but I think about like the musicals. I mean, I just think some of those high profile extracurriculars have the potential to get financial support from people who, you know, really care about those, who want a sponsorship opportunity, just want to, you know, let the community know they're behind the school district.
Well, the program for the musical is an example
Yeah.
where they really do get the community, and they get a lot of financial support from businesses that want to advertise, from community organizations that want to advertise in the musical. And that's one of their big revenue streams,
Yeah.
besides the ticket sales, of course. But their big revenue stream is that the booklet that is put together for the musical, and also a smaller version of it for the fall play. So they do tap into that.
Yeah, and that's something we've supported. And again, I feel like those hinge though on somebody who's connected with said activity, knowing how to contact the business. Because even as somebody, even if our organization has been very involved, there's things I find out about. I'm like, oh, nobody told me that was an option. Let's do that. Like, I would like to find a more comprehensive approach where I think organizations can give more significant dollars, as opposed to hoping that the students who connected with the musical or with the sports team or with whatever knows to contact somebody. I'm not sure what that looks like, but I do feel like there's, you know, significant untapped potential there, particularly if it's tied to some of the discussion we're having around families' inability to pay for that, and the pool of people who participate being limited because of the financial challenges. I think there's businesses and nonprofits that would be very open to helping with that.
Yeah, one of the challenges is that depending on who is collecting the money, they often like to have a say in how that money is spent, right? And so that then becomes an issue more of policy 915. And if you're asking people to go out and do the work of collecting money or fundraising, but say that's all going to go into one pot, and just, that might not be a real motivator for some people to go out and try. So we would have to make sure we're looking at, and as a board, what you can be really proud of is the fact that on this side of the table, you have this guy looking at how do we get all these kids involved, and on this side of the table, you have this guy going, right, and here's how much that's going to cost the district, and from a very real perspective, right? So $65,000 is nothing to sneeze at. And then if you say, well, and we want to provide additional funding to offset other costs, I think to your point, now that becomes almost a six-figure number pretty quickly. And now we're talking about something significant. And it's, I think, good for the board to know that that debate is happening, all with good intentions from everybody, but that is going back and forth, and the value of the committee to continue to investigate this, which is why you're not seeing policy recommendations tonight. You're getting background information about a future policy recommendation.
And the rationale that you just shared was in part behind kind of the flattening out of the booster clubs and the PTO and some of those.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I feel like there's precedent for some of that.
A structure has been put in place that could complement what you're saying through MMA, through the district-wide PTO, and an overarching athletic view. It's just not how people are used to operating.
And so and maybe you guys have explored this, the committee, you all. Have you looked at how other school districts are dealing with this question?
More so from people's anecdotal awareness than a deep dive into other districts. When we surveyed the different organizations, one of the questions that we had on there was specifically, are you aware of how other regional, like and similar districts are handling the financial aspects? And a number of them did come back with yes, I know that this school district does this or that.
Yeah, and I realize there's a lot, you know, all these decisions have implications for other, you know, you could hire a capital fundraiser. I'm sure there's school districts that do that, but then what's that do to operation, to the Wildcat Foundation? I mean, yeah, just posing some questions.
Complex. There is a
Yes.
level of complexity, and I admire the fact that we're going after that and trying to peel away the layers to get to, and I think the ultimate goal is you started off with, the ultimate goal, and I love to keep repeating this, is we want our activities, our groups, and our teams to look like our classrooms in terms of the makeup of our student population. And frankly, they don't currently. And that's a problem. We should all be concerned as to why is that the case and what can we do about it. So the idea that we're doing some amazing things in this district. Let's not turn our nose at that either, right? There's a lot of great things we can do better. And how do we make sure that through the policy we set it up that we can do better?
Well, to your point, do we think they don't look like our classrooms because of a booster club? Or do we think it's because of transportation? Or do we think, I mean, there's so many other blockers that.
Or just the activity itself.
I think the answer to that is yes. That's a tough part. Every one of those is a contributing factor to one degree or another. You know, the ability to get back to school. If you're not practicing right after school and you're practicing later on the day, someone that has to be able to get back to school. It's just the ability to balance so many different things. That was one of the things that also came up when we talked a little bit about, is do you provide some additional transportation like that? And then if you do provide that additional transportation, that's an additional cost. So that means you have to have, it's kind of one of the slow snowballs rolling downhill.
At a time when it's challenging to find bus drivers anyway.
Well, yeah, I think
we used to have community buses, or activity buses, but I was thinking,
I think some of the questions in the conversation, this is great, by the way, ultimately will probably stem from the formula that Mr. Bitts had shared around what is the scope of the activity, the costs, and who bears some of those costs, and to what extent. So the district, the booster club, the parents, and ultimately, when you look at those three buckets and how much is being asked in each of those three buckets, that funding probably becomes a derivative of that. To Dr. Lebo's point, if we're asking more of the individual programs and booster clubs, well, you don't want to handcuff them from a fundraising perspective. But then if the district is bearing more of that, does that look different than from a funding perspective in terms of community contributions and things like that? So many other connected conversations. But
I never really thought about it until you had the one slide up there, when you had just the examples of the different organizations that you looked at. But one that just sticks out to me is something like the ski club. It's really not something that the school directly funds. At least they didn't when it was started. It was really just a staff member who also worked at Round Top, wanted to be able to pass discounts to students to get them involved in something that he loved to do. And is something like that even part of this, or is that something that should be placed somewhere else, like the rec board, or are we looking at it differently of, say, something like the marching band that actually is a cost to the district and the taxpayers versus a staff member who's merely using the organizational structure to run some sort of program that isn't really costing the district anything? Have we looked at that differently? Like,
I think that's where the committee got to saying that we need to look at it differently.
right. Because I never really even thought about something like the ski club of being that, at one time like you were supposed to pay $1 if you wanted to do it, and then you could purchase the discounted things. But it wasn't really something the school was directly involved with.
or the French trip.
Right, which obviously you have to be a French student, and I'm sure that the teacher or the advisor would.
But there are other trips that you don't necessarily have to be in that language. And some of us maybe fell off financially, but still would say, I'm not willing to take that expense.
Right.
So I mean, yeah, there's just, there are layers of like, what's,
I just never really looked at it. So we are looking at those as potentially different.
Yeah, I think when we
Thanks.
look at the entirety of the list, and you start to look at it through that lens, I think some different types of organizations start to pop out too.
Right.
Whether it be staple programs, if you will, as you were kind of describing, versus we've got tons of clubs and extracurriculars that don't cost a penny. It's kids that get together and play chess after school. We're providing the space and we're providing the advisor to be able to provide supervision, and maybe transportation to participate in something like that should be something that we look into. But we don't have any other recurring expenses.
Right.
And then you have trips, and you also have honor societies and that sort of thing. So I think it naturally starts to begin to say, okay, well, are there characteristics here that would lead us to one particular funding formula for this type of group, a different formula for this type of group, and so on.
Right.
There are some nearly 40 non-athletic clubs that we have at the high school. And the other part of it that as Mr. Fitz was saying, the other part that we're looking at is the majority of those clubs are not in the 10% model, but they're also requiring faculty advisors to give and they're not getting anything for that. And then some of them have travel that is built into it. TSA might be a case, chess club, different organizations that have their expenses associated with it as well. And so we started to look at that, and it expanded, at least for me, it expanded what I thought we were looking at.
Well, just that list it expanded it to me. Like,
Yes.
I didn't really think of some of these things as things that might fall under this umbrella, because there's not a funding issue from us or even from a booster club in really going into it. Very good.
Excellent.
Any other questions on the extracurricular policy committee?
I will say,
Or state.
being part of the committee, Mr. Fitz took on something that each meeting you could see it just grew and expanded, kind of like with a pasta bowl that every time you keep digging in, it kept getting in bigger and bigger. I went in thinking all we were going to talk about was the 10%, and think about it was going to be an easy 10% yes, 10% no. And as the stakeholders got together, and as Mr. Fitz started putting some questions out there and started asking some questions, started to see that it's not as simple as, from the outside, you might see it as it's very simple. From when you start to really peel it back and start to see what's underneath and see what's going on. So did a great job of trying to pull everything together. And I know the last meeting, he really wanted to come out with, this is a definitive answer, this is our solution, this is what we're going forward to. And we just kept spinning wheels, and he just kept with the flow. But it was well done, and as I said, he really wanted to come out with a solution and be able to come to the board and say, this is what we recommend. But it's just, it's far more complex than you really think it is when you really dig in and start to see it and start to see all the different pieces. And it was great. Much like we do everything in Mechanicsburg, we get those stakeholders from a lot of the different groups, having those different groups in to provide feedback beyond just the athletics and the major extracurricular activities that we have, and having some of the people with some of the minor activities and getting involved with that, you get their perspective as well. So it was good. It was a good experience.
Thank you for that insight. I mean, because that's, obviously we didn't see that. Any other questions, comments? Meeting is adjourned. And as a reminder, just the scheduling is next Tuesday is the next meeting.